Well, welcome everyone to AADA and AMCD's practice briefs. I am Dr. Jillian Bluford. I'm one of the task force members. And today I am so grateful to be joined by Dr. Alfonso Ferguson, who is a faculty member at Centenary University, located in Hackettstown, New Jersey. Dr. Ferguson is also a licensed mental health counselor in New York. And has a private practice there and specializes in working with multiple marginalized identities and individuals who are working through mood disorders. And so, Dr. Ferguson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. This is exciting.
Yeah. And so I'm just going to jump in with our, first kind of question, point of topic, and we'll go from there. And so describe the value of multiculturalism in the work that you do.
Actually, so that's a great question, right? And multiculturalism is important throughout all aspects of the work that I do. So just backing up and thinking about what multiculturalism mean, right? And for me, I've been using this working definition, if you will, around multicultural counseling, which is counseling that integrate cultural identities and take into account the influences that it may have on the counseling relationship. And what that has looked like for me is being cognizant of not only my own knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs when it comes to working with clients, but also what potential biases that may come up for me in a counseling session that I need to be cognizant about. And as you mentioned, I work with multiply marginalized communities, that being oftentimes individuals who identify as a person of color, either Black or brown, people who are identify as sexual minorities, in a sexual orientation outside of heterosexual sexuality, or even people who are ethnic minorities, people who are immigrants of lower SES. So I'm always cognizant of just how those different identities play with each other and how that creates a unique experience for that individual, but also how those very same identities play with each other for me, right? And being cognizant of my privilege in the therapeutic settings in ways in which I can maybe be oppressive, but also in ways in which I need to be cognizant of imposing my own biases and judgments. So again, that's just in one area, but it plays also not only in my classroom and my research as well, which I'll talk a little bit more about.
Yeah. So it seems like you're always trying to be aware of who's in the room with you and your own identities. How is that coming up or maybe not coming up? And it seems like you've translated that from like your work with your clients to in other pockets of like always just being aware of who's in the room, what identities are being discussed or considered.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as a new faculty, that often comes up in the classroom as well, right? Being cognizant of not only having somewhat of a multicultural agenda and being able to weave it in throughout any and every class that I teach, but being cognizant of the ways, even if I may be identified as the most oppressive person in the room, because let's be honest, right? The counseling field and our counseling students are often not of marginalized communities or not racially marginalized, if you will. So just being cognizant of positionality in the classroom, and that sometimes looks like how I deliver the information, how do I open space and create safe space for us to have critical but also fruitful conversations around multiculturalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads me to like my next question of social justice. And there's one thing to be aware of who's in the room, what identities
Sure.
are being present. And then there's another thing of like, okay, how can I advocate? How can I use, like you said, my privileges, my awareness, my education to then better the experience of others? So what role does social justice play in your work?
Oh, it plays a huge role. So let's go back to my clinical setting, right? So I identify as a social justice counselor, if you will, and that's being able to like recognize and identify the ways in which oppression, privilege, discrimination impacts my clients' lives. And so oftentimes we have very real conversations about what's happening in their life, but also what's happening in the world. I remember a few years back, I worked at a community agency, and this was in 2016, where Black and brown lives were dying by the hands of police brutality, like on a daily basis,
Mhm.
almost. Very similar to 2020, right?
Yeah, yeah.
On a daily basis, almost. And I was working at a community agency, and the agency as a whole, we were not having a conversation about it.
Mm.
We were, so my agency was located in Harlem, New York, which, you know, is an epicenter of Black and brown folks, right?
Mhm.
Rich African American culture. And so my clientele at that time were probably, let's say, 95% Black and brown folks. I mean, Harlem is transforming, you know, gentrification is real.
Yeah, yeah.
But I was serving about 95% Black and brown folks. And interestingly enough, being in that location, I was the only um, Black male therapist. There were
Wow.
maybe one or two on a staff of maybe 15 clinicians.
Okay.
There may have been three people of color,
Hmm.
which was really interesting given the demographic of the community we were serving.
Right.
But needless to say, as a department, we were not having conversations around how social justice or how to create a safe space for our clients who were coming in off of the street or who are experiencing these real life experiences in Harlem. And you know that was a very decided defining point for me around what do I want my social justice advocacy to look like in my practice?
Hmm.
Being very intentional on working with clients and bringing it into the room around what's happening in the community. How do they feel oppressed? How do they experience privilege, if at all? What does discrimination look like, not only in the center or in when they come into the building, but also like outside of here, you know?
Hmm.
And oftentimes it's for my clients, it was a point of conversation, and it may not be directly in alignment with or a cause or a trigger of their mental health challenges, but
Right.
it's obviously playing with it or in association with it or hyper intensifying it if that's a thing. So it was important for me to be clear around creating space so that we can have these conversations, so we can unpack how their inequalities or how they're disproportionately marginalized and how that's affecting their emotional and mental health well-being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like that, like you said, in a city like Harlem, where it's like if you want diverse clientele, like that's the place. But even the
Absolutely,
setting still wasn't diverse, and that kind of leads back to your point of, our profession is not
absolutely,
incredibly diverse. And so you, even though the agency itself wasn't having this conversation, like you took it upon yourself to
absolutely,
say, like, this is, regardless of what they're doing, I know this is impacting my clients, and so I'm gonna
absolutely.
do it. Yeah. And so when you think about, I'm sure you have worked with clients, across the lifespan. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and what is important to you to consider when you're working with clients of all different ages and backgrounds, and bringing still in that multicultural counseling, the social justice counseling? How do you consider lifespan and all of that?
So there are a couple of things that I thought of, or I think of in this moment, and one of those are the social learning theory, right? Essentially, being able to understand or conceptualize how we learn the things we learn and how do we learn it through interactions, right? And with that, I think of like learned behaviors, right? Growing up, what are some of the things that we're seeing not only in our community, but within our family, within our peers that we adopt because it's normalized and it's identified as the norm. So we do these things. And I think of from the very early stage of adopting these behaviors or ideals, if you will, getting to a place in your adulthood where either you have to unlearn them or it no
Mm,
longer serves you in that way. And I often that often shows up with my clients, with their intersectionality, either being Black, male, and queer, and a lot of the overt microaggressions or learnings that they've learned at a very young age around masculinity and heterosexuality, and some of those things are embedded in religion, right? And we know
mm,
religion is a really big part of our community as Black and brown folks. So what does it look like to carry some of those narratives throughout your life, and what are some of those consequences, whether it's internalized homophobia or self-hatred or challenges or resistance into coming to terms with their sexual orientation, right? And so as they get to throughout their lifespan, they get to a certain age where they're exploring and they're identifying and they're connecting with a certain belief that they weren't subscribing to. So they have to unlearn those things, right? So I see it in my therapeutic practices all the time where we're kind of going through this phase of throughout their lives, what does it look like to learn and then unlearn and relearn and create new normals for yourself? And that sometimes required, setting boundaries with folks, and then some of those folks are sometimes family members,
Yeah.
right? And so another thing I think about is just ideally like the Eric Erickson's model, right, of psychosocial development, and what does it look like in each phase of your life to have a different crisis or challenge, if you will, that you have to work through. So that's something I also think about with my clients, and where are they in their lives, right? What identities or psychosocial crises that they're working through that they feel that they may not have the language for it, but providing some education of and normalizing what their experiences are has been really helpful in my practice working with my clients.
Right. Yeah. And I wonder if sometimes I see that same ideals and even working like with my students, like how do
Sure.
I, help them to unlearn and relearn what they even thought counseling was, working with particular populations before they get out there and are working with
Absolutely.
clients. Like how do we, change some of that narrative?
Absolutely, and I think it's great. I think what I'm really excited about being a faculty member, and I've had some adjunct experiences, but working in a graduate program is you have different walks of lives of different ages, right? Because for some people it's their second or third career, for some people they're fresh out of undergrad. So it's really interesting, and I always have to be cognizant and mindful of where they are in those developmental stages. Whether it's what are their purpose or their motivation for seeking this degree, and how they intend to use the degree. I'm always cognizant of not only of their racial and their identity makeups, but also what phase they are in their development.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I see that come through a lot of like where are they, in their lifespan development, like chronologically, but also like they're starting the program all at the same time. And so like
Sure.
there's also like a different developmental space that they're in
Absolutely.
there, regardless of their age. And that's both the challenge and I think the growth in educating,
Absolutely.
right? How
It's
do
a
you
gift
meet
and a
everybody?
curse.
Right, right. How do you meet everyone where they are and deliver similar content?
Absolutely.
And hopefully they all are able to obtain it.
Yes.
Okay, so my last question that I have for you are just some concrete examples that demonstrate how you pull in multiculturalism, social justice across the lifespan. And this can
Mm-hmm.
be, in your work as a mental health counselor, as an educator, supervisor, researcher, all the hats that I'm sure that you wear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'll start with my role as a mental health counselor, as a clinician. And so I think and I've kind of mentioned this here and there throughout this conversation. As a clinician, I'm always very mindful of like the client's cultural makeup as well as my cultural makeup, or my multiculturalism and their multiculturalism, and how it navigates or plays with each other, or how it may not. Being cognizant of my own in that relationship, always being cognizant of my own privileges and areas of oppression and similar to them, and wanting to be very intentional around creating space for them to have some of those conversations that they wouldn't normally have, whether easy and or difficult, right? And so in my practice, I'm always somewhat focused on exploring their experiences up until now, right? What are some of those experiences throughout your life, those, as I've mentioned before, social interaction experiences that have facilitated teachings or learned behaviors for you, and how have you utilized or not utilized it? How have it created trauma or traumatic experiences for you, even if you didn't have the language of what trauma looked like, right? How in your community are you either normalizing or have you normalized mental health challenges? I think one of the things that I'm excited about when working with people of color are being able to have of like name things and identify things and provide some psychoeducation around mental health and well-being. Being that we're of this community, so myself, I'm from a Afro-Caribbean community. And I was speaking with a colleague earlier this week, and we were talking about this idea around mental health. And so for me personally, I actually didn't identify or know that counseling was a thing or was real until my last semester of my bachelor's degree,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I took this intro to counseling elective course for undergraduates, and it opened up my role as to kind of things that I was able to notice throughout my life, not only with my family, but also close friends where they're experiencing symptoms of depression or symptoms of anxiety. And, it's keep it in the family, talk with friends, keep it
Mm-hmm.
close, talk with your pastor, and
Yeah.
not have conversations with quote unquote outsiders who may be counselors who can support you through it.
Right.
So I often pride myself on being intentional on not only creating a safe space, but also psychoeducation and providing my clients with the language to be able to describe or identify what they're experiencing, and also normalizing it at the same time, right?
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear that or see that we're slowly but surely moving in a space of um, viewing mental health within the Black and Brown community as a challenge and a struggle that any and everyone can experience, and not
Right.
just certain people who are of privilege, if you will.
Right. Right.
In my research, how I've definitely used it is I immediately think about my dissertation, and so my dissertation kind of focuses on the lived experiences of gay Afro-Caribbean male immigrants.
Mm.
And through my questioning, it kind of tracks throughout their lifespan or throughout their time on this earth up until now, throughout their migration, living on the island and then living in the US, and some of those challenges that they've experienced, some of those learned behaviors, if you will, talk about how the media has influenced how they conceptualize or connect with their sexual orientation,
Mm-hmm.
religion, and legalities and laws that have been imposed on them back home versus here
Right.
being in the U.S. So it shows up in my research in that way, but also I've been very intentional on my research agenda and working with marginalized communities, not only working with transracial adoption, but also working with Black male and counselor education and what are
Mm.
those experiences like. So I'm always cognizant of how our earlier years have informed our most recent experiences. And if we're able to connect with that, then maybe we can either shift the course if we feel like we need to, or own what our experiences are
Mm.
and use it as a power play or a power move, if you will, rather than a deficit.
Right.
Uh, and then in education, as I mentioned before, just continuing to interweave multiculturalism in any and every class that I teach, but also being very forthcoming and intentional around social justice and social justice advocacy. I
Mm.
was teaching a class, I think it was last night, and I talked about the importance of multiculturalism is an everyday ongoing decision. It's not a decision that you make um, when you're in a session with a client or you're faced with a conflict with a client. It's something that you always have to cognizantly think about throughout every and any experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a
Absolutely.
very long-winded answer.
But no, I appreciate it, and just appreciate the work that you do, the voices that you try to amplify, and thank you for meeting with me and
Oh, you're
sharing a little bit of your
welcome.
insights, yeah, and expertise with us. I know that many of us will appreciate it, and so thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.